And we are back with the APIM Hotrod, the last episode of 2024. Stefan, how are you?
Fine, great, Massimo. And you?
I'm super happy, looking forward for the holiday seasons.
Yeah,
Take a break, enjoy some family, and have some quality time.
yeah. That's indeed.
Okay,
IT is one thing, but there is not only IT in life, so we have to enjoy.
exactly. So
Indeed, indeed.
we are having fun with this little show, with this conversation, talking about technology, but also it's also fun having spending time with friends and family.
Yeah, indeed,
Okay,
indeed.
good. So some episodes ago we talked about connectivity from on premises to the cloud, to API management in the cloud. Today we
Yeah,
will look at the other way around, so from on cloud, from the cloud to
yeah.
on premises. In order to, as usual, to facilitate the discussion, let me bring the screen into the stage.
Yes,
Here we are.
yeah, indeed, Massimo. So, as you pointed out, we discussed the reverse path a few episodes ago, how to consume cloud APIs, cloud-hosted APIs from on-prem. And so here, let's see the contrary. So from the cloud, how do you consume backends that are hosted on premises? And for this, I see, let's say, two major paths to this. One is when you don't have an API gateway on-prem, right? It depends, and not all companies already have an API gateway on-prem. And the other one where you already have an existing API gateway that is not Azure API Management, for instance, or when you plan to, let's say, create another instance that is really on-prem specific. So even if you don't have one. So let's start with the first option. So let's assume that you don't have an API gateway on-prem, so your backend services are on-prem here somewhere. You will have most likely firewalls in the past between, let's say, the two data centers. And then we have, of course, the traditional hub and spoke in the cloud where we have our hub and then we have our spokes. And so if I take, let's say, this basic setup here, my API client would be a cloud hosted, let's say, uh, solution. And so that cloud-hosted solution needs to basically access an on-prem backend. So that's what we have here. So ultimately, we need to go here and basically get this backend do something for us. So first thing that you need to do, of course, if you take Azure API Management as a proxy, I would say, because you don't have any gateway on-prem and you don't want to, let's say, take the time to install all of that on-prem, because of course in the cloud it can sometimes go faster. Then of course you will still have, of course, to publish your apps, right? Your APIs to the cloud hosted gateway. So that's of course something that will be a prerequisite, whatever technology you deal with, whether it's REST APIs or other type of APIs, they would need to be published as a step one, I would say. Then of course, in terms of connectivity, here we're going to have the hub and spoke, traditional hub and spoke. So of course the spoke will have to go back to an API management that could be in the hub or in a separate VNet. But in this case, I didn't take all the flavors, unlike the first time when we discussed DC to cloud. So I invite you to watch this episode if you want to see all the possible flavors where you put APIM. But let's take the assumption here that this APIM is in the hub, right? And so basically, of course, then you will forward the traffic to the firewall. And then, of course, in the firewall, you would put the rules to let APIM go to the backend. In that case, it's all handled in the cloud. Of course, nothing prevents you from still having some rules here in your on-prem firewalls, but that's, let's say, one way to do. And then, of course, the firewall would just forward traffic to, let's say, through express route and then to your, let's say, backend on-prem. Yeah? And so in that case, from a connectivity standpoint, it's not too complicated. But of course, the key part will be the authorization piece. So if you have a backend on-prem, how do you make sure that you can authenticate against this backend? And that will, of course, depend on the ecosystem you work with. So do you already use OpenID Connect and OAuth on-prem? Do you use still old other authorization mechanism, like still, I don't know, is that still using Kerberos or NTLM, depending a bit on the on-prem machines that you are dealing with? That can be actually the most challenging part. So and so for this, There is no like black or white solutions for this. It really depends on your legacy, what you have, and what you don't have. But of course, there are multiple options here. So to authorize goals, either you can use Enter ID all the way, because here we are talking about on-prem APIs that on-prem clients, sorry, cloud-hosted clients that talk to on-prem APIs. So it's internal code, right? And maybe mostly for server to server. Then in that case, you could say that your backends and even your backends on-prem could also validate tokens coming from Enter ID, providing they have connectivity and so on. That's one possibility. You might have another authorization server that you already have, for instance, on-prem, something like identity server, Keycloak, and so on. That is actually living on-prem, and then to which cloud clients could request tokens before they can consume. And then your API gateway in the cloud would have to validate those tokens using the this authorization server. You see, so you have, let's say, the authorization piece really needs to be thought about. So you can also have things like protocol transition. So for instance, from the client to the API gateway in the cloud, you would use Entra. And then from the gateway to the actual backend, you might use certificate-based authentication or the mechanism that actually are maybe support legacy kind of ways of authentication if you don't have any other means. And of course, you can also have something called token exchange flow. So two separate authorization servers, and then with the, for instance, the Entra ID tokens could be exchanged to let's say, with other tokens that are issued by the authorization server that you have on-prem. So I think that the most challenging part is really the authorization piece, not too much about connectivity. So that's one way to do. If you don't have an API gateway on-prem, you can use Azure. So of course, with ExpressRoute or side-to-side VPN, you have connectivity. Uh, of course, you will have, it's a hybrid, so you will have some latency due to the distance between the data centers. So that's unavoidable. Hence, again, also that you need to think about the authorization piece, because if all on-prem clients, cloud clients, sorry, needs to ask tokens to an on-prem, um, let's say, authorization server, then it means that for each token request, you also have this latency that you can't avoid, let's say, because of course, if you go from Amsterdam to Brussels, for instance, yeah, you will have like 10 milliseconds latency per round trip. That's not
And
avoidable.
yeah,
Yeah,
and in
Massimo,
this
go ahead.
design, yeah, and in this design, Stefan, so the DNS is something that you manage. So it depends on customer by customer if it's on premises, if you just have to map the gateway subnet DNS. So how normally do you
Yeah.
see this?
Yeah, DNS is basically indeed, actually, it also applies to the reverse flow. So you need, of course, to be able to resolve stuff. So here, of course, if you have the API manager in the cloud, you might say that these ones only need to know about the API gateway, right, DNS wise. And then this one would actually make the call really to the actual backend. So this guy needs to be aware of the on-prem domains. But typically, if you have like a centralized DNS model, so where you have DNS zones attached to the hub and so on, um, you might have a conditional forwarding rule that says, okay, whenever you target an on-prem, let's say, domain, then forward it to this on-prem DNS server, or you have things in like if you use, for instance, info blocks, that's a usual suspect. It's commonly used in on-premise environments. Then you might extend your info blocks, or say, okay, with for instance, private DNS resolver in the cloud, you say, okay, whenever you have this on-prem domain, forward it to the infoblox on-prem, right? And then you need
Yeah.
to have the IPs of the infoblox servers to let them basically resolve these on-prem resources. So that's I didn't put DNS here. I to try to make it as simple as
Yeah,
possible.
yeah, yeah.
But I
Yeah, I
would
just
say, yeah, no, no,
just
but
mention because like most of the time DNS is the culprit in this kind of stuff, right?
no, indeed, and that's indeed an essential foundation. Otherwise, if you don't have DNS, then nothing works. So, yeah, that's of course important. Another thing that is important is, of course, certificates. So, if your backends, if you have TLS all the way, and your backends services, let's say return certificates that are issued by a custom CA certificate authority, then it will not be trusted by default, right? in, let's say, in the cloud. So they will not know, the cloud doesn't know about your custom CA. So you might also use APIM in this case as a way to bridge that, so that to let APIM trust that CA, right here at this level. So these guys are agnostic to this, and then APIM is trusting the CA. So that's something. And then when APIM makes a call to the backend, then it will trust the CA of the certificate that has signed the on-prem certificates. That's certificates are actually even more to be considered than DNS. But DNS is of course an essential foundation, but I think solutions
Yeah,
are
but
easier. Yeah.
it is very good to give that responsibility to API management, so that you create that abstraction. So if so you don't have to, let's say, the client doesn't have to care about that
No,
CA.
indeed.
So then if tomorrow you switch to another service or whatever,
Yeah.
you have no impact on your client. You can do
No,
it, let's
and
say,
I would say that's
transparently.
true for every hybrid traffic. So today in Azure, most by default, no service supports custom CAs. I mean, it's not by default. It will of course not be recognized because these are custom CAs. But if you take, for instance, the app service here, and there's the app service icon, today only the ASE supports it, right? App service environment. So otherwise, you would need to trust that in the code, which is not a good practice. So only the ASE with isolated app service plans will basically allow you to inject a custom CA. So you see, it can be very. So if you don't have an abstraction layer, it can be very invasive for the real clients. In AKS, you can do that as well, but it's also not a walk in the park. So trusting the
But
CAs are
anyway,
very touchy.
it will be difficult in the terms of making the solution future-proof, right, Stefan?
Indeed, that's one thing, and then it's also always how could I say, a bit cumbersome and sometimes it's just not possible. So, for instance, if you take
Yeah.
the multi-tenant plans, they cannot trust then a custom CA. So you see, you have so Azure Functions and so on. So you need an ASC, and ASC can be seen as overkill, especially cost-wise, if it's just for the custom CA, right? So in this case, APIM can play the abstraction layer and trust the CA, and all the clients do not have to care about the on-prem CA, basically. So that's one option. So any question on this, Massimo? Is that clear?
Yeah, very clear.
Yeah.
So I interrupt you a couple of times. Sorry for this.
No,
So
no, no. It's good. It's good. So it's good that you ask the questions that indeed or viewers might want to ask, but they're not offered to ask a question because we are recording this. But anyway, so that's one thing. So the other possibility, which is also quite common, is basically when you already have an API gateway. Okay, so basically you might have most large enterprises already have an API gateway on-prem, right? And so then typically they don't use API management. Right? They use, for instance, APIC, so API Connect from IBM, Axway. I would say you name it. It could be MuleSoft, whatever. So, but that's not APIM. So of course, because I say that's not APIM. No, if you already have Kubernetes on-prem or OpenShift and so on, you might still consider to use self-hosted gateways. They are so APIM self-hosted gateways are primarily used for backend to backend or API to API, on-prem API to on-prem API kind of scenario. But of course, if you already use that for this, you can also leverage the same technology for hybrid APIs. So that could be also something. But let's say if you are using APIC, Axway, and so on, typically then this guy will already validate tokens and so on. So when you have such a setup, you typically already use OO2 or OpenID Connect. And so then in that case, the client still in the cloud, of course, would then of course not talk to let's say a gateway in the cloud, right? So you don't have this abstraction layer anymore. Or the abstraction layer is actually here. So say that you have your say that you are using APIC, then of course this guy will also most likely return certificates that are signed by a custom CA. So here you have two choices. Either you say, well, you use certificates that are signed not by a custom CA but by a well-known authority. So you can also do that for private certificates. So it's not restricted to public certificates only. Either you might say that you trust, so it depends on the clients. As I said, if you would use AKS mostly on the client side or ASCs and so on, you might decide as well to register that custom CA on the client side so that it's trusted. Then you can keep using a CA. Either what you could do as well, I didn't put it here, but then you see that's the beauty of talking just like that and have a bit open discussion. You could also have an application gateway here, right? That is proxying the API connect on-prem or your API gateway on-prem, and that is trusting the CA. So that is just like a reverse proxy in this case. Of course, no need of a WAF, but so that could terminate somehow the CA trust, and that it makes your clients immune from the custom CA problem. So you have multiple ways. So I didn't put it on the picture. Maybe I will add it. All these diagrams anyway, you can find. You'll see the GitHub link. I'll publish them and I'll add the application gateway option as well. And so here again, the challenge will also still be, of course, about authorization, like in the first scenario. So how do you make sure that you can authorize stuff? So again, can do enter ID all the way. It's unlikely in this case because if you have an existing API gateway, probably they already have their custom authorization server, like maybe they use identity server, Keycloak, you name it. And then cloud clients could request tokens to these, but then same remark as before, take into account the latency. So whenever a client needs to consume an API, it will then have to make a token request. So make sure that you have a lifetime that is good enough to a good balance between security and performance, for instance. Or you might also have scenarios where you exchange. So here I didn't put enter ID, but a token exchange flow is something that is documented, that exists. In practice, is not that frequent. I know one company doing that, but yeah, you have multiple options here, but two challenges I would say in this scenario is still authorization, as in the first one, and certificates. It's even more kind of a challenge here because the API gateway is not here, so you cannot use APIM to trust this. So either app gateway, either use a well-known authority to sign those private certificates, but it's not my preferred choice in terms of pure security. So
Yeah, as the same before, so depending how many services you have on premises managed by, let's say, suppose different teams, you might have different configuration. Okay, it's a little bit bizarre kind of scenario. So in that case, it might be better to have an abstraction at the top, like as you said, with application gateway. It will make, let's say, easier again if for consumers. It's just how much are we putting in the shoes of our consumer, how much we want to provide or which kind of services we want to provide to our consumer, internal or external.
Indeed. And I would say as well for the authorization part, it can be rather easily tackled if we only talk about server to server kind of interaction. So like in old words, it would mean a client credentialing grant. Now, if you need to have a cloud user somehow, right? Because you have a UI in the cloud and you need to request a token to that gateway on-prem to consume an API that is exposed to the gateway on-prem, then it becomes harder because then you need to have the user identity fly onto the backend, right? And so that means it's of course more restrictive in terms of which type of flows you can use. So that is the authorization piece can be challenging depending really on what is the usage. If it's only server to server, it's easier, I would say.
And do you see customer more than just say stick to user to server and try to make the user context flying down?
I see stuff that should not be seen, but I see that because the problem is that between theory and practice, then of course you have a gap. So what I see often in practice, which is for me an entire pattern, but it's always the same: no money or no time, and so you take decisions that are not always the best ones. But what I see often is that you have between the cloud and the on-prem, let's say APIs, you have a server-to-server interaction, but between the cloud, let's say UI and the cloud API, you have a user a flow, so like authorization code grant or
Mhm.
PDC and so on. So then you have a real token with the user information, and then the cloud backend, of course, if you request a new access token to the on-prem authorization server, right, because it got client
And then
credentials,
it
and
injects
then they
user
embed, yeah,
presenter.
they embed the user in the payload, for instance, of the HTTP request or as an HTTP header, whatever. But then, of course, if those client credentials that you receive from the on-prem authorization servers get compromised, then you could impersonate any user,
Yeah.
which is then not great. But I've seen that more often than not. And so, because to really avoid this, then you need to go for token exchange flow. And
Yeah.
that's one of the ways. Yeah. Or to
Broker
directly
somehow the token with a different token is sort of you put in place or a federation or a token brokering service that you can exchange.
indeed, that can really then include the actual user identity received from a token that is considered, of course, more trusted into another token trusted by the other party. And
Yeah.
then the user identity is inside the token, is signed by an issuer that you trust, and is of course much more robust than starting to add stuff in the HTTP body or HTTP headers, whatever, however you do it. That is weak. But that's something I see, to be honest,
Yeah.
more
Also,
often
I
than not.
believe that people. Okay, so I agree with you. It's one thing is money and easier and faster. The other things is like, oh yeah, so then we can have more control. We can inject whatever we want in that cloud
Yeah,
premises channel. So from a development point of view, people say, we can have that flexibility, but
of course.
it's a sort of a sort of pact with the devil.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, it's dangerous. So it's dangerous, and of course, you might say it depends on how you see threats. If you see threats only with external eyes, I mean, that threats come only from external attackers, then okay, it's maybe unlikely the client credentials managed on-prem will be a problem, but there are also malicious insiders, right? People who
Yeah.
see those credentials, who generate them, and so on, and these could go home and then say, yeah, you know what, let's have fun a bit. So you see, you have to not
Yeah.
underestimate that aspect as well. But that's anyway trade-off between security and flexibility, and that's the same story whatever matter we are dealing with.
Okay, great. Very interesting. So we are at the end of these episodes, Stefan. So thank
Yeah,
you for your the explanation of this use case, this scenario.
yeah,
We are at the end of the year, so it's time to wish everyone that is watching this video a happy holiday season.
indeed.
Enjoy the next the break if you're having a break
Yeah,
with the lovely one or whoever you like.
yeah, perfect indeed, Massimo. So was great.
So
So yeah, go ahead.
are we getting are we going back next year? So we'll be here on this show. Yes or no? What do you feel?
But for me, I'm still okay. So let's
Oh,
see. It seems that we have good feedback so far. So
yeah,
let's go ahead and then maybe expand it even to broader topics. But
yeah.
indeed, we can see what
Yeah,
can be done
so
next year.
we'll so no. If you like to watch this video, this kind this little show, no worries. We will be back. We always let our little brains working and for new things and new topics, and we are always open for guests, ideas, and everything. So
Yeah,
thank you,
indeed.
Stefan. I
Thank you,
wish everyone
Massimo.
a wonderful end of 2024 and 25 full of success and joy.
Same for me. Thank you, guys. See you later.